Millions of years after the last dinosaurs passed into history, their fossils have helped us create a vivid portrait of what they looked like. Now, paleontologists are developing some surprising and extremely unusual new ways to learn about the lifestyles of these remarkable creatures. It's often been said, you are what you eat. Back in the days of bobby socks and varsity sweaters, the local diner was more than just a restaurant. It was a way of life. These days, paleontologists believe that when dinosaurs stepped out for a bite to eat, they told us all about themselves as well.
Primordial soup, please.
It's a story mirrored in the day-to-day operations of a joint, like the Dino Diner. Like us, dinosaurs had very definite eating habits, from strict vegetarians to meat eaters. And like any huge machine, they needed enormous amounts of fuel. In fact, all the food served at the Dino Diner in a day may not equal the size of one portion when a hungry sauropod sat down to lunch.
There you go.
Thanks.
Enjoy, ma'am.
Jim Farlow at the University of Indiana is a dino gourmet, and he's worked out how much food the biggest dinosaur of them all, the sauropod, would have needed just to keep that huge body stoked with fuel.
Well, we know how much animals of various sizes today eat, and so we can get some calculations of how much you would expect an animal to eat for a given size, if it's either warm-blooded or cold-blooded. And for a 70-ton sauropod, if it were warm-blooded, it'd eat a couple million kilojoules a day. Okay, you don't know what that is. Well, it's about that much hay.
Mm. 17 bales of hay is more than a lot of creatures eat in a month. But if sauropods were warm-blooded, a question still hotly debated among paleontologists. That's the minimum they would have needed. And because Jim knows that sauropods didn't have any food as nutritious as hay, he's calculated a warm-blooded creature would have spent at least 22 hours of every day eating.
And that doesn't leave much time for other activities like sleeping or making baby sauropods. So I don't think they were warm-blooded. I think it more likely that they were cold-blooded. And based on what we see in cold-blooded animals today, we can estimate that the amount of food a 70-ton sauropod would need if cold-blooded would be about that much. 6 bales of hay.
Where did sauropods do their grocery shopping? Some paleontologists think their long neck allowed them to frequent the most out-of-the-way of ancient eating establishments, the treetops. But is that how they ate?
We're 50, 60 feet off the ground and well within the range of the neck of a really big sauropod. The argument has been that maybe the heart wouldn't have been strong enough to pump the blood up to the brain when the neck is way up high. The problem then would have been if there's not enough blood to the brain, the animal might have fainted, and for a 70-ton animal to faint and hit the ground would be not very good. So a lot of people argue that maybe they used their necks horizontally and fed close to the ground, like a gigantic vacuum cleaner. And they may well have done that, but I suspect that they did a little bit of both.
By shopping in both the street-level and high-rise supermarkets of the day, sauropods found the key to supporting the largest body the world has ever known. Even so, they would have needed an enormous area to feed in.
I would guess that a cold-blooded 70-ton sauropod if you were putting it on really good pasture land like we have here in Indiana today, you might have needed something like 25 acres to support it.
And yet, we know the quality of merchandise back then was not nearly as nutritious as modern-day produce. So each sauropod may have needed more than 250 acres to satisfy its appetite.
So you can kind of visualize them as gigantic multi-ton locusts moving over the landscape, stripping it clean, and then moving on to feed elsewhere.
There you go.
But for confirmed vegetarians, feeding on relatively unnutritious plants just didn't provide the kind of energy a growing creature needs, unless you eat an awful lot. Meat eaters had it a little easier. With each bite chock full of nutrition, they didn't have to eat as much or as often.
Right now, I'm rather glad I'm not a plant. There's plenty, no rushing here. An herbivore like these cattle is going after a lot of spread out, dispersed, not in themselves very nutritious kinds of food. A carnivore on the other, easy, watch the foot. A carnivore, on the other hand, is going after big packets of food that is of very high quality, a lot of protein content, a lot of energy content. This guy, for example, looks delicious.
Because high-energy meat meals were much harder to find and catch, there were far fewer carnivores, but at least they didn't need to shop nearly as often.
If a Tyrannosaurus were lucky enough to kill a Triceratops, it would get to feed on an animal about the same size as it is. It would probably gorge itself, guts flying everywhere, bones crunching, the big teeth ripping out the flesh. Your worst nightmare. It would probably eat close to its own body weight, I would guess. And then, if it were cold-blooded, it doesn't have to eat anything for a very long time. That single meal might last it months, perhaps even an entire year before it'd have to go looking for food again.
But if you're not as big as a T-Rex, then you can't wolf down a whole year's worth of food in one sitting.
Is he going to stay the night?
Smaller meat-eating dinosaurs had to have a very different shopping strategy. The vicious Deinonychus had eyes too big for their stomachs. Too small by themselves to catch big meals they craved, they preferred dining in a communal setting. Lacking the teeth to tear through tough flesh, Deinonychus used a much more lethal utensil, a spring-loaded, retractable claw that would carve so deep into even the largest sauropods, their stomachs would fall out. So even the largest dinosaurs of all were vulnerable to smaller predators that attacked in packs. The best chefs often search long and hard for seasonal and difficult-to-find delicacies. In the dinosaur world, you had to be prepared to go out of your way and resort to any means to find your favorite meal.
One bounty burger, one curly fries.
Back in the kitchen, the chef toasts, fries, and chops, preparing the raw ingredients he'll need to cook. A couple 100 million years ago, dinosaurs had their own means of preparing meals to their liking. In his laboratory at the University of California, Greg Erickson believes he has discovered how one predator prepared his favorite dish. Greg began with the leftovers from a prehistoric meal, a giant mauled bone, but experimented using a modern bone with similar properties.
Looks pretty good. Let's go with it.
The bone originally belonged to a Triceratops, a 7-ton creature with deadly horns and heavy armor. The mauled section was from the formidable pelvis of this tank-like creature. It had obviously been through more than one battle, its final fight, clearly a losing effort.
When I first saw the pelvis, it had all kinds of punctures and gouges in it. We counted about 60 bite marks in it, and there's about 20 others that are probable bite marks, but they kind of overlie one another. There were some punctures that were about 3.5 inches in depth. There were cut marks that were about 8 inches in length. So it basically looked like a giant dog had been gnawing on this huge bone and kind of really worked it over.
Greg first needed to identify who made the bite marks. A large crocodile was a strong possibility, but Greg had a hunch the marks belonged to the largest carnivore that ever lived, Tyrannosaurus Rex. In Indonesia today, the fearsome Komodo Dragon uses a similar technique, clamping down with its teeth and levering its lunch into the air and tearing it apart. But for Greg to be certain a T-Rex had been gnawing on the Triceratops bone, first he had to make a copy of the bite marks.
What we did is we took dental putty. This is the sort of putty your dentist uses to make casts of your teeth. And we took a big wad of this and we pushed it down into one of the deeper puncture marks. And when we pulled it out, it came out looking very similar to an actual adult Tyrannosaurus Rex tooth.
Now that Greg knew the chef, the next step was figuring out how the dish was prepared. He placed a bronze cast of the T-Rex tooth on a hydraulic loading frame. When the loading pressure was increased to create bite marks that matched those on the Triceratops pelvis, Greg knew he had effectively simulated the bite force of a T-Rex.
Well, it's hard to fathom the magnitude of the forces involved here as this tooth is punching through these bones. It's almost like a hot knife cutting through butter. It certainly convinced me at that point that T-Rex was quite a mean, rough fellow.
Greg calculated the bite force at 3,000 pounds, roughly 10 times stronger than a great white shark. It meant a T-Rex had the bite strength to devour creatures its own size, even a 7-ton Triceratops.
What does 3,000 pounds equal to? Well, it'd be like, say, if you took this tooth, were to set it on top of yourself, let's say, and set a pickup truck on top of the tooth. Then you imagine it would punch quite a hole in you. So it was quite a large amount of force. I think certainly it could open its mouth 2.5 feet. I expect they could take a pretty good chunk of meat out of whatever they bit into, maybe 50, 75 pounds of flesh, about equivalent to maybe a hind quarter of a cow today. I think you could probably stuff in there pretty reasonably without too much trouble.
Greg's study has proven the teeth of a T-Rex could withstand the stresses of biting into struggling prey, and Greg thinks this sheds some light on an age-old mystery. Was it merely a scavenger of dead dinosaurs, or was it the biggest, baddest fighter of all time?
Well, sometimes I wonder how strongly other scientists believe that this animal actually was a scavenger. I mean, if you were to say, put all of us that believe that T-Rex was a predator and all of us that believe that it was a scavenger, and put us all out, say, on a football field, and put a Tyrannosaur at one end of that football field, I'd be willing to bet there wouldn't be too many scientists standing in the middle of the field when that Tyrannosaur started rambling towards the midfield. I know that I would probably be one of the first people heading out the stadium tunnel.
So based on how a T-Rex ate, paleontologists have concluded it was probably agile and fast, the dagger-like horns of a Triceratops were a dangerous defense. To survive, the T-Rex must have used stealth and a final rapid dash to avoid a serious encounter with one of those deadly horns. But at times, T-Rex must have met its match. When humans overindulge, we can resort to an array of pills and potions. Dinosaurs had their own remedies for a bad case of indigestion. Whether haute cuisine or a simple salad bar, cooking is the art of combining the ingredients to the customer's liking. Dinosaurs had their own internal food processors to produce the nourishment they needed. Peter Dodson of the University of Pennsylvania loves a big meal, and he's fascinated with the mechanics of digestion in the really big eaters of the dinosaur world.
How did they get it all down? Well, if they ate very succulent foods like these grapes, which I'm stomping on, grapes are very easy to crush and release the nutrition. But there were no grapes back in the sauropods' day, and very few succulent foods. They had to eat very tough, fibrous foods. How did they deal with this?
Sauropods had terrible table manners, often swallowing their food whole, but that meant it had to be broken down in their stomachs. And because much of the food was tough, leafy tissue with very little nutrition, they had to eat prodigious amounts. For Peter, here again, eating habits are a window into the dinosaurs' world.
Their ability to process plant food was rather limited. This suggests that the energy flow, their energy budgets were rather modest. And these very same dinosaurs, sauropods, stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, had the smallest brains of all dinosaurs. So this suggests that their overall lifestyle was a rather slow pace. These were the Model T Fords of the dinosaur world.
Dinosaurs that swallowed large amounts of whole or hard-to-digest food had to work overtime simply to extract what little nutrition the food possessed. How they actually did that was a mystery until recently discovered fossils revealed that dinosaurs, presumably as a sort of aperitif, swallowed stones to help their digestion.
Sauropods were eating fibrous leaf material, and by themselves, leaves are hard to digest. The stomach is a very muscular organ, so as the stomach churned a great mass of stones rubbed against each other, and they rubbed against the plant material too. And as they tumbled, the plant material was nicely broken up into small fragments, which are much more easily digested.
But stones were only the beginning. Like cows, dinosaurs relied on microbes in their stomachs to aid digestion and break down their food into a form they could easily convert to energy.
A 70-ton sauropod dinosaur is an enormous animal, and the size of its fermentation vat would have been staggering. We reckon it was somewhere around 10 tons. That would have been equivalent to 30 barrels of wine. 30 barrels!
But like anyone who overindulges, a 10-ton fermentation vat for a stomach would have produced, let's say, side effects.
Fermentation is a chemical process which produces large quantities of gas. And our giant sauropod was fermenting 10 tons of plant material. It must have produced prodigious quantities of gas. In a word, it produced wind.
What someone eats can tell us a lot about them. But for one scientist, the interesting part starts when the eating is finished. After all is said and done, and eaten, restaurants, like all creatures, must relieve themselves of unwanted leftovers. To one scientist, even that can tell us a lot about how dinosaurs lived. Karen Chin of the University of Santa Barbara is a connoisseur of dinosaur dung. Produced in the days before scooping laws, there is miraculously a lot to be found, if you know what to look for. And yet it's not a field everyone finds, well, appetizing.
Actually, when you first start looking at dinosaur dung, it doesn't look like your typical fossil dung that you'll find in museums. Most of that is rather, sausage shaped, or looks quite a bit like dog droppings. So we had to find other ways to determine that this indeed is fossil dung.
On the vast Montana plains where Karen does her field work, it's not as though she has to watch where she steps. 100-million-year-old dung is as difficult to find as it is to identify. But considering the gigantic proportions of some dinosaurs, Karen received help from creatures much smaller than she ever expected. Dung beetles have been around for over 200 million years, surviving then off the dung of dinos just as they do off the droppings of mammals today. The beetles excavated through the fresh dung, creating an underground network of tunnels. Each new tunnel was later filled in by sediment, leaving the dung full of vertical tubes of different material.
What they would do is stuff dung down into the sediment and lay an egg right in that dung. And the young grubs, when they hatch out, would have plenty to eat in those provisioned burrows.
Dinosaur dung is known as a trace fossil. It leaves no direct clues as to who left it, but there is plenty of circumstantial evidence. The first clue lay scattered around Karen's study site in the shadows of the Rockies. Thousands of pieces of bone, all from the same creature, a duck-billed dinosaur called Maiasaura. The second clue also pointed to Maiasaura. The dung was full of very finely chewed fibrous material, which could easily have been produced by the battery of grinding teeth in the mouth of a duck-billed dinosaur. The final clue was the size of the droppings themselves. Most fossilized dinosaur dung has shattered over the years under the impact of the weather. But by carefully putting these pieces back together, Karen calculates the average size of these droppings as the equivalent of 6 quarts, or 1.5 gallons of dung.
So you can imagine that the dinosaur that produced this massive fecal material must have been a fairly good-sized dinosaur. And the Maiasaura was approximately 24 feet long and was certainly capable of producing quite a bit of dung.
In her latest study, Karen believes that the answer to one of paleontology's greatest mysteries has come right out of the dinosaurs themselves. From the very bottom of the food chain, Karen has found bits of bone from the very top.
In the piece of probable T-Rex dung, we found bits and pieces of bone. And by examining these pieces of bone, we were able to tell that these were actually pieces of dinosaur bone. So this is really exciting information because for years and years and years, we've been speculating what these large carnivorous dinosaurs were feeding on. But now we actually have direct evidence by looking at the dung that tyrannosaurs did actually feed on other dinosaurs.
All over the globe, scientists are beginning to reconstruct a much better picture of what life was like millions of years ago. Clues to dinosaur behavior keep popping up in some of the most unlikely places. What they ate and why tells us a lot about their daily routine. Almost as if we'd found a sauropod's appointment book, giving us a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-at-a-glance view of the likes and dislikes of these remarkable creatures.